Hi, this is Hugh Taylor. I'm here with Jamie Brown, Senior Director of Global Governmental Affairs at Tenable Security. Welcome, Jamie.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Yeah. So I serve as Senior Director of Global Government Affairs at Tenable, where I work with policymakers primarily on strategic partnerships, including public-private partnerships, where government and industry work together to try to solve cybersecurity challenges, and work doing that both in the U.S. and globally. And I also serve as the chair of the IT Sector Coordinating Council, which is actually an example of a public-private partnership. It's the primary IT industry body responsible for working with DHS and the federal government on cybersecurity and critical infrastructure protection.
Okay. But what's your background in this? Did you work in government before you worked in the private industry?
Yes, yeah. So I've served a couple of stints in government, both in the Congress, but most recently was working on the House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology, where I managed cybersecurity, innovation, and other R&D, federal R&D budget issues.
Great. So let's talk about, how does a public-private partnership work? I mean, and there's probably more than one kind, but tell me how they work in general, or some examples.
Yeah, generally speaking, public-private partnerships are used to combine to bring together the combined resources and expertise of both the government and industry. So government has an excellent ability to convene different stakeholders, to set policy goals, outcomes, and to develop standards. And industry is able to bring both expertise and visibility. The vast majority of cybersecurity is managed in the private sector, protecting critical infrastructure. And when you bring together those two sort of areas of expertise, you're able to build towards better outcomes, better solutions to some of the challenges that are out there. And the challenges are significant, so they're obviously very important.
But can you tell me a little bit about sort of the life cycle of a project like this, and the governance of it? Like, who's in control and how do you come up with a plan and that sort of thing?
Yeah, so as you had noted, public-private partnerships take different forms. Sometimes I think a good example is the development of the NIST cybersecurity framework. And that was launched initially several years ago, but President Obama signed an executive order that outlined a series of steps that NIST had to work with industry to develop a framework of cybersecurity recommendations, outcomes that would help protect across different critical infrastructure sectors. NIST was very, very intentional about setting up a series of stakeholder meetings, soliciting input, both written, verbal, from private industry, academia, other organizations, in order to come up with a common set of best practices that ultimately resulted in the framework. So I think that's a really good example. More recently, DHS partnered with both the IT and the communications sectors to develop or to establish what is called the Information and Communications Technology Supply Chain Risk Management Task Force. So there was a recognition that there were a number of cybersecurity supply chain challenges facing organizations, not only in the IT and communications sectors, but across critical infrastructure. So they convened industry, government officials to come together to identify, what are the key challenges that are being faced by both government and industry, and then, okay, how do we prioritize and how do we set up a series of recommendations and guidance to help address these challenges? And that's work that's been going on over the last 2-3 years, and I think has been very successful in delivering a series of reports, guidance, and really good practical information that can be utilized by both government and by the private sector to help secure their supply chain. So that's another good example of a public-private partnership.
So I'm not sure if, let me know if you can answer this, but do you have a feeling like, is this a preferable approach to, say, trying to legislate a solution to like supply chain or a risk like that?
So it's an excellent question, and I do think legislation plays a key role in cybersecurity policy and improving national cybersecurity. So, but I think there's a specific role for legislation, and then there's a role for public-private partnerships. Legislation, I think it's perfectly appropriate in certain cases, particularly when you're talking about the critical infrastructure, that we rely on for drinking water, for transportation, for healthcare, for laws to set outcomes and demand or require a minimum standard of care, basically raising the bar for cybersecurity. Having said that, it's not appropriate for legislation to then specifically identify and choose technologies that you ought to use or particular solutions that ought to be utilized to fulfill those outcomes. That's where I think a public-private partnership can come in. So you'll have the top line legislative goals and outcomes that policymakers are looking for, but then you leverage public-private partnership to develop the best practices, the guidance to feed into standards that help you achieve those outcomes.
It sounds like I'm trying to understand like what's in it for a private business.
Yeah.
It sounds like at a minimum, it sort of gives you a sense of this is where we stand. This is what's expected of us. And these are reasonable standards to adhere to. So it's not like everyone flying off in a million directions. Are there other benefits to a private business and being involved in this kind of thing?
Well, yeah, I think there's the benefit of relevance. So private businesses are ultimately they're the entities that will have to implement any of the guidance or recommendations coming out of the public-private partnership. If you leverage the expertise, the visibility that the private sector entities have, and ensure that is or any of the outcomes or guidance are that they reflect those inputs, that visibility, that expertise, the policy will be a lot more relevant, as opposed to if private industry sat back and wasn't willing to engage. It would almost it would create a vacuum that policymakers might feel they would have to fill, and they could do so inadvertently by establishing a set of regulations or requirements or controls that may not be relevant to current technologies, that may become obsolete quickly just because of the pace of technological change. And so I think there's definitely incentive for the private sector to be engaged. And the private sector also is subject to cybersecurity attacks, the vast majority of them. So we definitely benefit from the guidance, the recommendations, in certain cases, requirements or controls or standards that come out of these, because it helps raise the bar. It helps protect us from cyber attacks as well.
So it sounds like, if I'm hearing you right, that there's a couple of different layers of benefit. One is that they avoid like a regulatory burden that might be not suited to what's actually happening or might become obsolete. But then also it sounds like you're creating a mechanism to keep adapting, which may be lacking in a regulatory situation.
I think that's right. And circling back to the NIST framework, that's a good example. I think they intend to, they have revised the framework, smaller revisions, I would say, in the few years following its release. I think they intend to do a more fundamental update now, but because they are continually in conversations, doing consultations with private sector entities, with academia, researchers, other organizations, they're able to make adjustments, changes as appropriate. And here with this sort of, I would say, more fundamental version, because they've kept that connective tissue in place, I think they're starting from a much stronger place than they are, for instance, from when they initially launched it. So we should be able to really come up with new relevant recommendations, guidance, outcomes that will be reflected in the next framework, ideally in a quicker fashion, and for future iterations as well.
I'm reminded of a joke that George Shultz once told. Someone asked him, how do you compare being Secretary of State to working at Bechtel Corporation, and he said, in a private business, unlike the government, if you ask someone to do something, there's a danger they might actually do it. But it makes me wonder. So here's the question. There's a lot of benefit to this, but what can go wrong with a public-private partnership? Is there a downside, or are there things to avoid?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I think for the most part they're very beneficial. Some of the challenges that can occur might be when you bring in so many stakeholders. If you don't have a clear direction where you're trying to head, you could come up with an open-ended process that might not really result in any guidance or a specific recommendations that would improve things in a market way. Another way, if it's too small, you run the risk of vendor lock-in, where there could be some capture from certain entities. I think the federal government has gotten quite good at public-private partnerships. They know these challenges. They know in most cases how to avoid them, but I think they always have to keep that in mind because those challenges do exist. So again, outcomes focused on the one hand, and then making sure you are bringing in a broad set of stakeholders so that it isn't captured by particular vendors that may have more resources that they can bring to bear.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I mean, do you think that Congress should be doing more to encourage public-private partnerships, or are they wisely staying away from this? And what do you think is happening?
I think Congress recognizes the benefit and value of partnerships. I think they recognize the importance of stakeholder engagement. But the policy, first of all, the technology environment will continue to change, as will then the cybersecurity environment along with it. And at times there will be needs for new legislation. We happen to support the incident reporting legislation that unfortunately wasn't included at the end of the year, and we hope it was taken up again. We think that is good policy that will drive better outcomes. So I think Congress is supportive of these partnerships. I think as appropriate, Congress will have continue to have a very important role to play to set new policies as the technology environment changes, as risks change. But anytime they do so, I would hope that they would continue to leverage industry engagement with academics and other organizations to come up with the implementation and to facilitate the actual requirements, recommendations, et cetera.
Interesting. Okay. So it sounds like that in general that the public-private partnerships there's no overall policy saying, there shall be such partnerships, and there's no entity in control. It's not, is there any policy body that says we're in charge of all public-private policy situations, or is it more informal?
It's more, so I would say both, and if it probably does, but I think what it is, different agencies have different responsibilities. So for instance, the Department of Commerce, NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, is housed under the Department of Commerce. So they have a very important role, historically they have had in working with industry and, developing public-private partnerships. And NIST has been, they've been the long-term experts in this. But increasingly over the last several years, Department of Homeland Security, given their role to protect both federal civilian agencies, but also to help protect critical infrastructure, they are recognizing and leveraging the power of these partnerships. And then other sector-specific agencies like the Department of Energy, for instance, the EPA, they have energy, the electric grid and water, respectively, over the two agencies. Those industries are also facing cyber attacks. I think they are recognizing the importance of working with industry to come up with good guidance standards, and then in certain cases, requirements too.
And so now did I just hear you say that Tenable is involved in these sort of partnerships too?
Yeah, we're pretty active. In fact, there's a new public-private partnership that DHS has launched called the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, or JCDC. It is trying to both work on identifying more proactive and strategic cybersecurity protection plans, but also incident response. And this JCDC, there was a recent vulnerability, the Log4j vulnerability that's attacking, unfortunately, a vast number of different entities. And this DHS JCDC partnership has been very active in both getting recommendations, advice from the private sector, also utilizing the private sector partners to socialize some of the guidance that is coming out of DHS. So we've been active working there. Tenable is also, our co-founder, Jack Hufford, is a member of the President's National Security Telecommunications Advisory Committee. DC is famous for all of its acronyms, so that one is the NSTAC. But that really outlines strategic technology and cybersecurity. It seeks to address strategic technology and cybersecurity challenges and come up with longer term sort of policy recommendations. So we're active there. And then I actually, as I said at the outset, I serve as the chair of the ITSEC, which is active with DHS and the federal government as well.
Very impressive. All right. Well, wonderful. Well, this has been great. Is there anything else you want to add on this topic? Otherwise, we can wrap up.
I think we have covered most of it. I think there is a great deal of value in leveraging these partnerships. I think given the increasing cybersecurity challenges that we're facing, both from state actors, non-state criminal actors, what have you, that we're only going to have to rely more and more on these. And we're going to have to be nimble. We're going to have to be flexible. And we're all going to have to dedicate the appropriate amount of resource towards these partnerships in order to improve national cybersecurity. So I recognize there are a number of challenges out there, but I'm hopeful about what I see in terms of all of these different actors being willing to engage.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you, Jamie, so much for being with us today.
That was my pleasure. Thank you very much, Hugh.